Normally, I'm the last resort of Aspen India to moderate a session, but today I volunteered because I thought this is definitely India's Japan moment, and I hope it is also Japan's India moment, both ways, not just one way. And I thought this was a good time when we have a new government, a new Prime Minister here, Mr. Narendra Modi, and PM Abe-san on the other side, both of whom are very connected to each other, to talk about what are the new things we can do with each other, what are the big ideas going forward, and of course, what are the challenges which need to be overcome on both sides. In the last 14, 15 years, Japan's investment into India has been about $15, $16 billion. Okay, not a big deal, but not insignificant. But the trade between Japan and India is pathetic. It's about little over 2% of India's total trade. So you can look at it in a depressed way, or you can say there's a huge potential here. So that's on the economic side. The tourism, again, I think the potential is far greater than what's happening. Japanese tourists visit Buddhist sites, particularly in Gaya and elsewhere. But can we tap into the Japanese traveler much more? On the energy side, Japan, without any energy resources, Suresh, has an amazing track record in the world for energy management, for energy conservation, for energy technology. And it reminds me of a remark that Prime Minister Modi made on 8th of June at his residence. He said that if the US can change the whole energy dependent situation of the US, why can't we? And I think Japan could be a very major player in our plans going forward. We are not doing anything, as far as I know, on defense. We have national security concerns in India. We surely should be looking at defense collaboration in a much bigger way, and also defense industries and companies working together. This may be a new idea that people can think of. There's been some discussion on nuclear cooperation, but it is yet to get going. And maybe there are many other areas of opportunity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the three of us sitting here, Mr. Suresh Prabhu, former minister, Mr. Jay Panda, member of parliament, and myself, have been involved in a track 2 strategic dialogue with Japan for several years. And our Japanese friend, Professor Tom Taniguchi, who you see on the screen, and who is special advisor to the Prime Minister's cabinet in Tokyo, joined us, has also been involved from that side. If I'm not mistaken, Ambassador Lamba has been participating in this occasionally in between his preoccupations with Pakistan and Afghanistan. So we have some history of working together, of taking the relationship forward. I have a question. I mean, can we go to $100 billion of Japanese FDI into India in the next 5-10 years? China got $1 trillion of foreign investment in 12 years, 2001 to 2013. Can we get $1 trillion of foreign investment in 10 years, 2014 to 2024? And can Japan be a major figure in all this? We are talking of high-speed trains, we are talking of infrastructure and many other areas of cooperation. So I'm very glad actually that the Prime Minister's visit to Japan has been rescheduled for two reasons. One, I think Prime Minister should go there after the budget. We want to know what are the new economic policies of the government of India, of this new government of India. We want to know, and I think Japanese would like to know, what are your new policies on foreign investment, on trade, on tax, etc. So I think Prime Minister going to Japan after that event is very important, rather than going before, as it was earlier scheduled for 3rd and 4th July, where in our parliamentary system, he really could not convey what's coming in the budget, even if he knew it at that time. Second is, I think it gives us more time to plan. It gives us more time to think of ideas. And so in this session today, I hope we will come up with new ideas. Everyone's bio has been circulated, so I'm not going to read that out. Aftab Seth, whom I have not mentioned, is a permanent ambassador of India to Japan because he's made it his lifetime preoccupation and commitment. So we'll bring him in. But I'll start with you, Jay Panda, because you've been a regular in Japan. We've been in the trilateral dialogue, we've been in bilateral. You have led delegations of members of parliament to Japan. So what do you think of this? Is it the moment or is it not the moment?
I think it's the moment, but I want to give a little bit of a backdrop here. We shouldn't see this as just a great moment. It's, of course, that as well. But I see this in terms of a tectonic shift in the politics of certainly India, and as far as I can understand, in Japan, and also one of timing. Now, if you look back in history, I want to use another example, a déjà vu moment, if you will, not involving India and Japan, but involving the US and UK. In the late 70s and early 80s, after 2 decades of what can be described as economic slowdown, economic malaise, you had the Thatcher and the Reagan revolution in the UK and the US. And they did something that I think is relevant for what is happening in India and happening in Japan today. There was a complete redefinition of the political agenda. There was a complete redefinition of what earned votes and the prioritization of the economy. What you're seeing today started a couple of years ago with Prime Minister Abe coming into office and now with Prime Minister Modi in office. You see that resonance in both countries. The topmost priority in both countries has been, and now becoming in India, is the economy. If you remember that famous poster from Bill Clinton's campaign war room, "It's the economy, stupid," is, I think, relevant for both countries today. Both leaders have focused primarily on fixing the domestic economy. That, of course, involves freer markets, it involves freer trade, it involves cross-border investment, all of that. There is also another angle on which there is a similarity, which is taking pride in the nation. National pride, if you will, has defined the campaigns and the administrations of both Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi from his chief minister days till now. The most important thing is that both of these are happening at the same time. You've had flashes of center-right politics in both India and Japan in the last 10 or 15 years, but they haven't happened at the same time. And the third thing that's happening is, I think, the synergy and even the personal rapport that the two leaders share, the vision that the two leaders share. If you look at it from that perspective, I think what we can expect is a complete redefinition of the relationship. It is not an incremental change of trajectory. I think it's a complete re-engineering of our internal focus, of our politics, and the bilateral relationship. I think there's no reason why we can't aim at the numbers that you've been speaking about.
Suresh?
You know, all this relationship, particularly with different countries, are driven by their own priorities and how they look at the world from their own eyes. I think this is for the first time we are seeing a huge convergence between the interest of Japan and India in many areas. Particularly if you look at how Japan looks at Asia, particularly the neighborhood, and the same way how India looks in the same region from her own eyes. I think there is huge convergence in that. We are not neighbors, Japan and India, but we have a common neighbor. And that also makes a lot of convergence of interest. And therefore, to look at the rest of the world from our own eyes, then we realize that probably we can do a lot of things together. Fortunately, we do not have any contentious issue between Japan and India bilaterally. In fact, something like none, except probably how we look at nuclear issues and how Japan looks at the same issues. Probably that could be the one point. But otherwise, I think this is virtually a tension-free relationship. And therefore, if you have convergence of interest and you can see the huge opportunities of working together, then I think this is the time for both the countries to actually seize this moment with both the hands and probably with 4 hands together. And to make that, we really need to find out what are the building blocks to create this relationship. Our priority obviously is economic development because still we have a large number of poor and we must find out how we could remove that poverty. Employment is an issue. Increasing share of manufacturing into GDP is an issue for India. To create infrastructure is a big issue for India. And if you really look at it, on all this, Japan has a priority. In fact, Japanese companies are really well known for creating infrastructure. Japan has always developed their economic model, particularly in the last 30 years, in which manufacturing has always been outsourced. First, they created Southeast Asia by outsourcing that, then in China, and now it could be India. To make that happen, one of the problems that Japanese companies face is the type of red tapeism, the roadblock that we have, which unfortunately there is a level playing field because Indian companies face the same problem. So I think we have, in a way, negative level playing field. But to remove that, if you can create a special economic zones only for Japanese companies, in which the entire infrastructure will be created by Japan and will be operated by Japanese companies, which is allowed under the SEZ law, and also we can actually create manufacturing hubs for Japanese companies. The low-cost manufacturing has always been, labor-intensive manufacturing has always been outsourced, so that could be one. And now even China, the cost of labor is going up, so there is an opportunity there. But also probably moving into the value-add chain and try to look into the little intermediary issues. In fact, if you really look at it, the first Japanese car company came to India, Suzuki, then many other came, which created a huge supply chain for auto components. And now India is part of our auto component chain, supply chain globally. So just imagine that India could be now sitting on a great opportunity in which when the China's labor costs are going up, Southeast Asia still not so competitive in terms of labor costs, probably India could be playing that big role and for Japan. The third part of this is the Japanese financial investment. Besides investment that will come along with their actual real economic investment like manufacturing or infrastructure, Japan has got again over $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. And the ability of Japanese to invest that money is very limited. They have been investing into treasury bills of US. They have been also investing into other countries, but there is a substantial possibility. The risk factor is the Japanese inflation is 1% and India's inflation is 10% plus. So always there is a huge downside to that. If we can develop a model in which we can take care of these inflation related issues, probably Japanese investment could come into India in a big way. And there is also a possibility. When we talk about public partnership, and my friend was talking about PPP a little while ago, and if you really look at it, the PPP is only in terms of private-public partnership in which we try to give viability funding because we realize that some of the companies cannot afford to do it on a commercial basis if there is no viability funding. Here, that interest differential, which could cause a concern to Japan, could actually be factored into these viability funding related issues. In any case, if you take 10-year time span, probably India's inflation will not be 10% plus all the time. And Japanese inflation also will rise because Japanese economy is expanding. So I think there could be a possibility of working on that. And therefore, I think there is a great opportunity. You asked me about energy, but if you want now or I can take you later, there's a huge opportunity for energy. And as you said, 1972, after the first oil shock, it's the only country in the world which became so energy efficient. and that's something which we can learn from Japan. Japan is the largest importer of LNG, but now they are actually trying to reduce that dependence by moving towards developing new sources of energy. They have stopped nuclear for a while. They are restarting some of the nuclear reactors. But new and renewable energy in Japan could be a great boom for India because we need that. In fact, I remember I was talking to my Japanese friends once and I said, you are a land of rising sun, but we are a land of shining sun because sun shines here all the time. So if you develop a solar energy, the potential for developing that is in India because we have got 300 days of sunshine, and that's Prime Minister Modi's very favorite project of can we bring together all those countries who have got 300 days of sunshine. So I think there are huge opportunities of energy, on infrastructure, on manufacturing, and all this will be the building blocks which will help to then converge in terms of geopolitics. That actually is now, we are already almost have a shared interest on that, and therefore we should really work on that. So I think this is a great opportunity. Japan and India, Japan has not signed strategic partnership with several countries, but we very few, and we are one of them. And that is again thanks to Prime Minister Abe-san. So I think it's a great opportunity when Abe-san on that side, Prime Minister Modi on this side, and they look at the same way the world. I think we should try to work together and try to move on for mutual benefit and also for the good of Asia and good of rest of the world, because I think these two countries could really shape the future of the world in a way that is something which should not worry others. We should not cause concern to others and should not cause nightmares to others. So this is a great opportunity.
Let me go to Tokyo now before I come to you, Aftab. Yes. Tom, you've been listening in to my colleagues on the panel. You have been deeply involved in the bilateral relationship. You work closely with successive prime ministers, and especially now with Abe-san. We welcome your comments and your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Das. Firstly, I've been very much pleased to joining some of my old friends, Aftab Seb, Suresh and BJ Panda, and Mr. Das. And I've thought that the title that you have chosen to call your conference, India's Japan Moment, is a very good one, because I've been one of those people who have long thought that now is Japan's India moment, as Mr. Das just said. If you look at what's cooking in Japan's foreign policy, I think India's looming larger still, and it's self-evident. And one thing that I should say is it's not just Prime Minister Abe's initiative. It's been a bipartisan initiative. If you recall, when Yukio Hatoyama's Prime Minister visited India, he succeeded in substantiating the relationship between the two nations. And I should also mention that soon Prime Minister Abe is going to make a visit to New Zealand, Australia, and Papua New Guinea. And the relationship with Australia and Japan, both countries have agreed, has been sort of upgraded to something that you could call a special relationship. So Aussies and the Japanese are now talking about their special relationship. And I am the one who hopes very much that sooner rather than later, Delhi-Tokyo relationship is going to be called also a very special relationship that encompasses not just economic relationships, of course, investment relationships, but also national security, foreign policy. For instance, India and Japan should work more closely together in enhancing the development in some of the African nations, because India still retains a great extent of influence in African nations, and Japan's African development policy should work very much in line with your policy towards Africa. Prime Minister Modi's visit, I think a lot of us have been waiting for it to happen, but in the postponement of the visit, as Mr. Das says, is going to be even better, because as Mr. Das says, Prime Minister Modi can can carry a greater weight in his visit to Tokyo, and both nations using the time allowed to work hard on giving even more beef to the visit. And Prime Minister Abe, let me just say, whenever he talks about India, I gather that India has taken a special place in the mind of Shinzo Abe. And Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister, has been his mentor in many respects, and he was not shy in calling Prime Minister Singh as one of his mentors. But I'm very much sure Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe are going to find themselves on exactly the same page on so many issues.
Tom, you have any specific worries about the Japan-India relationship? Anything that you see as a major challenge or a problem?
Well, that may sound a little bit ironic, but I have always thought the sky is the only limit for Delhi-Tokyo relationships. But now probably is the time for us to see the sky is an empty place. We've got to fulfill the sky with concrete results. And we have had many such candidates like Delhi-Mumbai corridor, or the potential cooperation on the nuclear energy front, and the potential cooperation on the front of defense relationships, or the defense equipment cooperation, and so on and so forth. And now is the time for Tokyo and Delhi to really substantiate the bilateral relationship.
Thank you. Thank you. You're going to stay with us, so I'll come back to you a little later.
Yes, I am.
Yeah?
Yes.
And perhaps some of the members in the audience may also like to question you. Aftab, you have been the lifetime ambassador of India to Japan. You still hop between Japan and India. You teach there, you speak the language. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Tarun. I think I'll do it by commenting on the things that you all have said, which will probably make it easier. You mentioned first energy, and Suresh also mentioned energy, quite right. That is a clear area of focus. Two examples. The inner loop battery, which is capable of being recharged 10,000 times, is obviously something that we in India, who are so energy short, can use. We, if you remember Brahma Chelani's book on water, we who are so water stressed need to use Toshiba's technology, which has produced a washing machine which recycles 80% of its water. So yes, energy saving, energy producing technologies, Japan is clearly number one. And that is because, as you rightly said, the 73 oil shock and the 1979 post-Iran revolution oil shock prompted them to undertake this, and they have mastered many of these technologies. You talked about defense. Now, yes, till 2000, there was virtually nothing on defense. Then in 99, one of their ships called the Alondra Rainbow was hijacked in the Indian Ocean, and we rescued it. That's what turned the Japanese strategic mind. Because in 98, they were very angry with us for the nuclear tests. But within a year, they invited Jaswant Singh, the foreign minister of the previous regime, to Japan in November 99. They invited George Fernandes, the defense minister, in January 2000. And he was the first Indian defense minister to Japan. So it started then. And it took a long time to get the first Japanese defense minister to India, Ishiba Shigeru, who's now the Secretary General of the LDP. And he came in May 2003. And that's when our naval exercises, our Coast Guard exercises began. And in the last regime of Abe Shinzo, we had two major exercises. And since you've been involved in the trilateral dialogue, you may remember that in April 2007, the Americans, the Japanese, and the Indians exercised off Okinawa. And in September of that year, we were joined, Tom, by the Australians and Singapore in the Bay of Bengal. So this strategic connecting has been going on for a while. So when we say moments, we have to be careful about moments because all moments are built on previous moments. So as you said, Manmohan Singh is considered a mentor of Abe. Don't forget, talking about personal rapport, which one of us mentioned here, Koizumi and Atal Bihari Vajpayee got on like a house on fire in 2001 December. And before that, Mori, who came here in August 2000, got on perfectly well with Vajpayee, and they're the ones who established the global partnership between India and Japan, which in December 2006, Manmohan Singh and again Shinzo Abe, who was by then Prime Minister, expanded to mean the global and strategic partnership. So there is a certain history to what we are, and no government can start ab initio, including this one. They have to build. No foreign policy is built afresh. This government, as any other government, has to build on the great achievements in India-Japan relations that have been made over the last decade. Challenges? Abe mentioned at the recent G7 meeting, I think Russia was excluded, so it was G7, that 2014 closely resembles the situation in 1914. How does it resemble? That a rising power, in those days it was Germany, is challenging the status quo powers. And so what Japan and India are experiencing today is this rising power, which is challenging above all Japan, which until 5 years ago was the leading economic power in Northeast Asia. But it is doing much more. It's challenging, bullying the Filipinos, and it's bullying our great friends, the Vietnamese. And we in India must be careful about that, just as much as the Japanese are careful about that. So we have to be conscious of the strategic environment in which both Japan and India are working. And yes, national pride was mentioned, but there is a flip side to national pride. And we must be very aware of that in India, because there is a danger that we will allow national pride to get the better of us. Now, Cabinet Secretary, Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga has got some researchers on the job of re-examining Prime Minister Murayama's apology for the comfort women and Yohei Kono's apology. Murayama did it in 1995, Yohei Kono did it in 1993. Now, in 2014, this is being unraveled, or likely to be unraveled. This has repercussions, and for us it's important because with Korea, as much as with Japan, we have a close security and defense relationship. So they are upset. Obviously, the Chinese are upset. So we have to be conscious of the fact that national pride may sometimes lead us onto a path which we would rather not go, as it just unravels situations which are settled. The Hindi, in our own context, being a case in point. The real areas of growth, I think, in strategic terms, are what happened. Two things happened in Abe's last visit in January 2014. One was the opening up of the Northeast, where it was agreed, one of the items on the joint statement, if you recall, is that Japan will help us to open up the infrastructure of the Northeast to connect us to Burma and ASEAN beyond. The second was the possibility, and we hope it will fructify, of the Japanese selling us some defense equipment, including the amphibious aircraft. They have changed their law, which allows the export of defense equipment for civilian purposes. Therefore, for the Coast Guard, it's all right. They won't sell it to the Navy. But they have sold such amphibious aircraft to the Indonesians 6, 7 years ago when the defense policy was changed. So there is a very good likelihood of that happening. Whether we can get Japanese investment up to 100 billion really depends on us, not them. The hollowing out of the Japanese economy began in the 70s when they started moving many of their factories to the Philippines, to Thailand, where Ambassador Arjun Asrani has served, to Indonesia and to other Southeast Asian countries. They could well hollow out their economy further and place their bets in India, but this depends on us. The recent experience of Daiichi Sankyo with Ranbaxy and NTT Docomo with Tata Teleservices, these were big investments, 4.6 billion and 2.7 billion respectively. Ranbaxy 4.6 and 2.7, NTT Docomo. And we all know what has happened to those investments. We have to be careful because everyone in Japan, Daiichi Sankyo next to Takeda is the second biggest pharmaceutical company in Japan. And what happens to Daiichi Sankyo matters. What happens to NTT Docomo, the biggest telecom company, matters. So we have to set our own house in order before we can expect that 100 billion. I'll stop there.
Jay, all this potential, and you use the word rightly, redefinition. Aftab has talked about some of the issues between the two countries. Do we know the Japanese enough? Do we need to invest more time and energy to connect with each other? Our business cultures, our other cultures and values, apart from simplifying things, procedures and opening up the economy, is there something more that we need to be doing to tap into this moment, as it were?
Short answer is yes. Let me give a longer answer as well. Suresh Prabhu talked about convergence, and Ambassador Seth talked about geopolitics bringing us together. These are very crucial aspects which are some of the tectonic forces I referred to earlier in pushing Japan and India together in shared interests. So despite the fact that we are not immediate neighbors, despite the fact that we are quite far away and haven't had the kind of contacts for the last many decades that you are just referring to now, despite that, natural interests are colluding or to bring us together. Now, I want to use a phrase called complementarity, because if you look at Japanese demographics, if you look at the Japanese economy, the complementarities are such that they will magnetically propel us together despite that lack of understanding of each other's systems, despite the lack of familiarity. Not very many Indians and Japanese have visited each other's countries compared to other bilateral relationships. But let me cite you what Prime Minister Abe has said. He has specifically said that the greatest potential of any bilateral relationship anywhere in the world lies between India and Japan. Let me cite a couple of other statistics to show where this is happening. And again, let me come back and answer your question and say, yes, of course, we need to promote more contact. We need to promote more understanding of each other's systems. We need to make the ease of investment, ease of business much easier in India and in Japan as well. A few years ago, I had the privilege of leading a delegation of MPs to Japan when briefly, this was 3 or 4 years ago, briefly, we thought we'd reached a historic moment when the annual outbound Japanese FDI into India exceeded the annual outbound Japanese FDI into China. We thought we'd reached a tipping point, but it turned out to be not the case. This time, I hope the timing is right. I do hope we've reached a tipping point because of the political changes that I've been referring to. So if you look at some of these figures, something close to 70 projects in infrastructure, which is one of the key areas in India, is being implemented with Japanese loan assistance. Cumulative Japanese ODA loan commitment to India is of the order of 4,000 billion yen. These are very, very significant numbers. If you look at just the DMIC, Japan has committed to invest $4.5 billion in this project. Talks are already undergoing in setting up a Japanese electronics manufacturing township. These are all relevant. A study is being conducted for the possibility of running a bullet train between Mumbai and Ahmedabad, and our Prime Minister has already announced that one of his big infrastructure initiatives is going to be a quadrilateral of high-speed trains around the country. This is transformational, just like Prime Minister Vajpayee's highways project was. And I'll conclude by saying that the complementarities we have in demographics, for instance. Japan has an aging population. Japan is not putting that many working age people into the economy every year. India has a huge advantage. Japan has technologies referred to by some of the speakers. India has the opportunity, India has the platform to be able to avail of that. And vice versa, India has barely scratched the IT services opportunity in Japan. And just like India needs to sort of streamline its business system, get rid of some of the red tape, I think Japan needs to take some similar steps to allow the kind of opportunities for Indian companies to tap the Japanese economy. And I think this coming together, better understanding of each other is a natural process which is already getting stepped up in a big way.
Tom, apart from all that we need to do on our side, on the Indian side, and Jay has referred to some of this, he's also referred to what needs to be done on your side. At this moment of time, the one big joint venture which has happened recently in the IT services area is between the Tata Consultancy Services and Mitsubishi. This is just born, but it's a big project, it's a big joint venture which will actually operate in Japan. Now this is very unusual, Tom, because in our perception, maybe right, maybe wrong, but you are a very open and frank person, so I can put this question to you to give an undiplomatic straight answer. Our perception is Japan is a very closed economy. You know, it's very difficult to get into Japan, to do business there, very difficult to export into Japan. There are many so-called barriers, as indeed they are in India, by the way. I'm not saying that it is one side. I mean, we are very conscious of the problems on our side, but we also have perceptions of problems on that side. Do you think Japan is ready to change? Are you seeing a time now under Abe-san's leadership where Japan will become more open in its domestic economy and its domestic policies?
Thank you, Tarun. That's a very, very good question. Let me think about it for a while. But before that, let me just give you a disclaimer. As you said, I'm speaking here strictly as a private individual, private academic, not as anyone representing the Japanese government. Having said that, I think Prime Minister Abe, in his second term, which he is now spending, has brought him to tackle a much, much wider range of issues due to economic fundamentals. Aging population, decreasing population, and in order for a mature industrialized economy such as Japan's, the only way for it to grow is to enhance its productivity, labor productivity. And the question is, how can we do that? One way for us to do that is to bring in as many catalysts as possible. One of those catalysts has long been regarded as opening Japan more toward the international community. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is now being worked out, is supposed to be giving a huge boost in that sense as a catalyst to boost Japan's economy. And Shinzo Abe, in his second term, has chosen to lay stress upon such things as the importance of including female labor force in the workplaces and in the management. And second of all, for the first time in Japan's modern history, the Shinzo Abe administration is now talking about the ultimate necessity for Japan to invite more workers from abroad so that they could join forces with the Japanese to build infrastructure, firstly in the tsunami-stricken area in the northeast part of Japan, and secondly to rebuild Tokyo's infrastructure in the run-up to the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games. All of you remember very much vividly that in 1964, Tokyo had Olympic Games. That was Japan's coming out party after the defeat of the Second World War. And then the next guiding principle that should guide the Japanese to celebrate another Olympic Games in 2020, I think is for Japan to celebrate the opening of the country yet further and cherishing the great amount of diversity in the society and so on and so forth. And India has to be an integral part of the new narrative that Japan is now is editing, if you like, for the 2020 Olympic Games. Now, let me just say a little bit about the national pride after he said about when it comes to Shinzo Abe's national pride, his is more like a forward-looking, not retrospective national pride. Because in order for Japan to grow economically, the first thing and the most important thing for Shinzo Abe to do is to boost the morale, especially among the young people. Over the last 20 years, when Japan has experienced a tremendous degree of economic malaise and deflation, their sense of pride has also shrunk, has also gotten much smaller. And so Shinzo Abe's generation, that includes myself, ought to tell the future generation of the Japanese that you can do much better. You can change Japan and you can make a difference. And unlike previously, let's say in 1964, Japan ought to encourage as many people from abroad as possible to be a narrative, to be an integral part of that narrative, that Japan can make a rebirth, Japan can be reborn into a vibrant and powerful economy.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. I want to ask a brief question to Aftab and Suresh. Is there enough study and research about Japan in India, Aftab? Do we have enough centers of Japanese studies? I know there is JNU, the university has something there. But beyond the university, is there something? And Suresh, you are the chairman of a very successful research group, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and you've talked about energy particularly. Are you doing enough Japan-focused work? So Aftab first, and then Suresh, and then we go to the floor.
Yes, the answer to your question is that we do not have enough. To give you a very stark example, we have less than 5,000 students of Indian origin in Japan. In comparison, there are 20, 30,000 Vietnamese, Indonesians, 70,000 Koreans, Japanese, Chinese for different reasons. But the number of Indians is pathetically small. Likewise, Japanese students in India are very, very few indeed, mainly for Buddhist studies. There are some in JNU. And that was the reason that Fukuda, Prime Minister Fukuda, had started a project called the Top 30, 30 Japanese universities, to promote Japanese higher education abroad. And we have been helping them to connect with Indian schools and so on. But Tom's university, which is my university, which is Keio, the oldest in Japan has started a very revolutionary thing, which is in one campus, the high-tech campus, Fujisawa campus, they've started undergraduate courses in English. Postgraduate courses in English have been going on at Keio and at Todai, Tokyo University and Waseda and others for a long time. But what Jun Murai has done, the dean of the Fujisawa campus, in starting English language courses, we hope will correct this imbalance in our relationship, low academic exchange, low research. We have people like Professor Kesav and Lalivar Verma and others in JNU who have been doing excellent work on Japan, but at a broad level, a lot more can be done.
Suresh, quick
No,
response.
you're absolutely right that we really need to know more about each other and try to work together on areas of common interest. For example, Japan has a very interesting institution, New Energy Development Organization, NEDO, which is trying to develop completely new technologies in areas of energy. Then Japan has been hosting a very interesting events on water for a long, long time. Of course, the environmental record of Japan is phenomenal. Despite having one of the highest population density, Japan has been able to maintain the biodiversity extremely well, particularly the forest. So I think these areas we can definitely must work together, and to be honest, I don't think we are doing enough at all, and that would help. One of the other area which is emerging is areas related to nuclear issues. After Fukushima, Japan has experienced some of the worst disasters ever, and also scrutiny not just from within but from outside as well. So I think those lessons would also be the lessons for India, because how to handle safety of nuclear reactors is a big challenge, not for Japan and India alone, but for the world, but for India particularly when we have this ambitious program. So I think there are many areas in which we can work together, and to make that happen, I think even we should agree at now when Prime Minister Modi is going to visit Japan, some sort of a protocol in which what type of umbrella research we should try to do together, which will actually benefit each other as well as the rest of the world. Again, on defense, I think that's something, for the first time, Japan is opening up. Japan's constitution constrained them from working on defense. But I think India's capability and Japan's expertise could be now leveraged. So I think that's another area of research we should try to work on. I think there are great opportunities.
Okay, let me go to the floor. Questions? Yes, sir. Just your name and a brief question. First row. Mike, please.
If I could beg indulgence for two quick questions. First, I'm curious about the potential
Your
for...
name, please.
Sorry, Manohar Thiagaraj. But curious about the potential for space-based solar, which is an area the Japanese, I believe, are world leaders in the research and is highly capital intensive. Maybe negative answer as well, but it's certainly been discussed. And second, in the defense realm, how do both countries see an Asian security architecture in the context of defense transfers? We've seen talk of Australia transferring submarine technology, Japan transferring submarine technology to Australia, which has different dynamics in an Asian security architecture. So how do both countries see an evolving Asian security architecture for defense cooperation?
Let's take one or two more questions. Yes, High Commissioner.
Thank you, Tarunda. I was surprised when Aftab mentioned China bullying Vietnam, Philippines. He did not mention India. China has been bullying India for quite some time. And I'm reminded of a meeting that former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong of Singapore had with Mr. C. Rangarajan, who was then governor of Andhra Pradesh, visiting in 2000. The first thing that Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong told Mr. C. Rangarajan, and I quote, "If India does not grow in tandem with China, China will intimidate India." And this is exactly what is happening. You know, nobody knows China better than the Singaporean leaders. Lee Kuan Yew told Prime Minister Narasimha Rao that this is 96, January 96, that world has only 15 years to tame China into international code of conduct. After 15 years, the China's shadow will loom so large that nobody, no Asian nation or a group of nations will be able to control China.
You have a question, Ambassador?
I have. Then, just 1 minute. Then he told Narasimha Rao that India must balance China and Indian Ocean, and both America and Japan must balance. What I want to say is that the main driver of India-Japan relationship is going to be the logic of strategy in the face of rise of China. We may say anything. Everything else will be an offshoot of it. Japan would like to strengthen India economically so that it can become a player in the strategy between China and all this.
Thank you. General, third row, please.
I'm General Lumber from the Indian Army, retired now. My question is that there is one aspect of defense cooperation and interdependence that we include as part of our discussions, and we've been doing it with every country. With Japan, taking Tom's point that Japan is virtually rewriting its narrative, and I dare say India is rewriting its narrative as well. I see a lot of commonality, having studied the security relationships in the region for the last 10 years and really absorbed how it can make an influence on some of the common threats. I think the challenge somewhere lies between knowing the threat and our inability or desire not to express it. When China has to say something, it economically engages with US and many other countries, but calls it as its #1 challenge or threat openly. It's time in this region that we step out to actually define a threat as it be, put our comprehensive thoughts together, because we are not looking at China. We need to put our thoughts together to bring stability in this region, and that could be a way of defining a threat and not just pointing at China. And my last thing is, we need clarity on our perception and our perspective. Till we have that, we would just be looking at various, since the 60s we've done it, or perhaps since the 50s we've done it. We've experienced enough amount of humiliation down the line, and like somebody said, there is great chance for intimidation as yet. And I think Japan and India both can make a huge difference at this moment.
Quick responses from the panel to the questions and comments. Jay?
Regarding space-based solar, I don't know anything about the subject. Now, being a politician, that shouldn't stop me from saying something. But since there are experts in the room, I shall refrain. Regarding defense, I know very little, so I'll just say the following. Geopolitics indeed is a very crucial part of what is pulling Japan and India together, but it's not the only part. There is inherent merit in the complementarities and the convergence that is happening on the economic front. I do know that on the defense front, India has asked Japan to participate in the Malabar exercises, which is between India and the US. And Japan's defense has traditionally depended on the US relationship. As Suresh Prabhu was mentioning, and as the General was just saying, there is a rewriting of the narrative that's taking place. I think there's enormous scope, not just for exercises, but in terms of technologies that have not been available to India so far. And I'll leave my comments at that.
Suresh?
So, in fact, obviously, the convergence of geopolitical interest is going to be the driving force. And that is the case. So that's why we have a common neighbor, I said, though we are not neighbors. So that is something which really brings a lot of similarity of approach towards some of the issues that confront each of us. But there are other many issues, and we have said 15 years, so they're now 18 years since then. So I think we are a little bit over that. So I think now we have to look at the reality, and therefore how to deal with the reality in a way that we should work so that both the countries can benefit. One of the areas that we should focus on, and General of course will talk about Army, but also the Navy, because to now secure a supply lines, I think Japan and India will have to work very closely with each other. It is not South China Sea, not East China Sea, but even Indian Ocean, which is actually going to be a very critical part of that. And therefore, I think we will need to look at these many issues. And Manohar, you have been expert on defense issues, so obviously you know it better. But I think now, of course, the defense is also now no longer the war is all, and that of course didn't work really in Iraq. But I think the new issue that is going to come up is the technology-oriented warfare. And therefore, I think Japan and India have a great opportunity of working together, because we could probably produce some of the warships, some of the submarines, and aircraft carriers in India, probably with the help of Japanese technology.
Tom, did you have any comments here?
Yes, sir. India being the largest member of the maritime nations that share the vast Indian Ocean, and Japan being one of the greatest members of the Pacific Rim nations, both are committed in the rule of law and democracy. And so those things alone should bring these nations closer and closer together, with or without the third party nation that we've been talking about. That's the first one, that's the first thing that I should say. And beyond the practicalities or pragmatic calculations, I think the spiritual ties that have connected these two nations, India and Japan, are actually much deeper than many of you in the room might have thought. Come visit in Japan and see how deep Indian connections in Japanese culture have run throughout the history of Japan. Just take a visit to one of the temples nearby, and it's very much easier for you to quickly notice that there are many, many Hindi gods in Japanese temple. And the modern day connections between intellectuals from both nations have been well received and well remembered. I don't know how many countries in the world that have never ceased to publish Tagore's anthology of poems and so on. And third, about the defense architecture, which actually is going to be even more needed in the future. We're talking about investing more into the East Asia Summit, which one has to say has been created by the joint effort between India, Japan, and Singapore and other nations. But East Asia Summit has to grow in order for us like-minded maritime democracies to chart the difficult course in the future and to set, most importantly, the principle of adhering to the rule of law. So that should be my answer to some of your comments.
Thank you. Mr. Atul Punj, Chairman, Punj Lloyd.
Thank you. While we're having a very interesting discussion at a high level, I think at the end of the day, the actual rollout of the relationship will happen on a company to company, whether it's public sector, private sector, with the Japanese corporations. The natural reluctance of Japanese companies to enter into agreements quickly, unlike in the Suzuki case where they were their own vendors who were tasked to set up a local vendor base, so that moved quite rapidly. We know that the natural reluctance of the Japanese to enter into a relationship without having spent 1, 2, 3 years in familiarizing yourself with each other is actually, I believe, going to be a major impediment to being able to fast track this relationship. So I think some thought needs to be given as to how do we set a framework in place to be able to create that level of trust and confidence between organizations on both sides. To be able to really implement these on a fast track. The high-level things about government bureaucracy on both sides or the difficulty of doing business exists on both sides, that I believe governments now will deal with. But I think the more important aspect that will follow soon, otherwise we'll find we've relaxed all the operating conditions, but the relationship which is able to exploit the opportunity will not really be able to get to the stage. Of course, recent events like you mentioned about Aichi, etc., have not helped matters. So we really, from the Indian side, will have to make the extra effort to go further down that path. So I think some thought needs to be given to that. So any views as to how that could happen would be welcome.
Let me just respond on what I know, Atul. There are now a huge number of Japanese companies with offices in India. This has happened over the last few years. Maybe they were anticipating a change for the better in terms of economic opportunities in India. Maybe it was something to do with the Chinese issue for them. But they have been doing a lot of work on the ground quietly here. It's not very well known. They don't publicize it. There is a Japan Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Japanese companies who represent them and take up issues on their behalf. But I think that you're absolutely right. They are extremely cautious, and they have a whole lot of processes which go back to Tokyo and back and forth, and missions come and missions go, and study goes on, and this is the way they are, and yet they go wrong. See? Yet they have had, some experiences which spread within the marketplace. But what I'm hearing from the companies now who are coming by to see me, or I'm in touch with, there is a very serious intent now to participate in India. And I think part of it is also this political. I think the Japanese companies also look to see what is the government of Japan thinking. What is the government of Japan saying green signal for India, or is a yellow light still, or is a red light? The sense I have is there's a lot of yellow to red for China, and there's a sort of yellow to green, more green towards India. But anybody like to add to this?
Can I? Yeah, there are what we are talking about, three things really. It is G to G, what should happen between government to government, which will really provide like an umbrella support. Typically, when you fight a war, you need to move Air Force, Navy, and Army at the same time. So the second one is B2B, between the business, and you said the absolutely right thing. And the third is P2P, in terms of bringing this misunderstanding or misgivings or lack of information gap to lowest. Now on this, once we have this government to government, which actually provides that air support, and lot of action happens on the ground, I think lot of business can come in. And look at the other issues. Japan is facing a lot of difficulties in China. Japanese investment is not necessarily one of the most welcome investment in the mainland China. So at that particular time, there is an opportunity for India. So to make that happen, obviously the business has to also move in, because it's not going to be possible between two prime ministers agreeing.
Increasing steadily over the last few years, and now it's well over 1,000, and every month 1 or 2 new companies are opening up offices here. They do that, as you rightly say, because of the political climate. They see the Abe visit in January. More significantly, they see the Emperor's visit in December 2013. Now, it may not mean anything to us, or not much to us. It means a great deal to the Japanese, because the Emperor was a semi-divine personage till 1945. He is still held in the highest esteem, and the fact that it's taken 50 years and no emperor goes outside Japan without the approval, let's not mince words, of the Foreign Office and the Imperial Household Agency. The fact that the emperor's visit has been approved in December 2013 is the biggest political signal that the Japanese could possibly give to their own people, that this is a country that we trust, and this is a country where you will be safe. That's one. And then, yes, Malabar is right. No, I had no intention of slurring over the fact that we are very much involved in this. And Lee Kuan Yew, that you quote, talked about the aeroplane. Remember that China and India were the 2 wings of the Singapore aeroplane. You can't move without either or without both. And this is a hard fact. Who is Singapore's largest trade partner? Who is India's largest trade partner? Who is Vietnam's largest trade partner? Who is Japan's largest trade partner? Who is the United States' largest trade partner? The neighbor that we are all talking about, and the neighbor that is the great security challenge. So, this is the reality. We have to work in tandem. Doing our security architecture that you talked about, EAS is absolutely correct, and Japan and Singapore were very helpful in getting us into the EAS in 2005, and this has been a good forum, along with the ASEAN 3, which is ASEAN 4, for us to interact on security matters with the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and others. So, yes, You were right about the spiritual links, Tom. And the temple that you are talking about, the one which is the biggest one, is Sanju Sangendo in Kyoto, which has 1,000 Indian gods lined up, complete with all their names. The Japanese may forget that those gods came from India, but that is living evidence of the fact that every day they worship Indian gods.
Harpal?
Yeah, this is really a question directed at Tom. Tom, you quite sort of, I think, sensitively referred to this spiritual links between the two countries. Ultimately, good partnerships that sustain over time is when partnerships benefit the common people. You talked about the advantage of currently the young of Japan being inspired into recognizing that if they view the world in a particular way, and this relationship in a particular way, it will be inspirational as far as the future is concerned. In India, we have a very vast and significant agenda around health and education. And I'm just sort of wondering, what is the view of the Abe government to addressing and partnering with India on these two very significant things, which is health and education? Frankly speaking, from a social agenda point of view, unless and until India moves on that front, much else will remain much lesser by comparison. So what is the Abe government's view to engaging this arena? Now in health, of course, we know whether it's pharmaceuticals, medical devices, medical technologies, delivery, there are much opportunities. But what's the view from your side about these sectors in India?
Let me say the following, but I have to confess I don't have much knowledge about that particular area. But certainly Japan's track record has included such initiatives as giving maternal care notebooks to each and every expecting mother. That's helped a great deal to, for those expecting mothers to think really hard about the health of the newborn babies that they are expecting to have. And after giving birth to those babies, to check their health record using that small notebook has also contributed a great deal to improving their health and well-being. That's one thing that's popped out of my mind. And also Japan's elementary schools. Ambassador said can tell us more about it because he's running his own Indian school in Tokyo, which is flourishing with the number of students increasing almost yearly. But each and every Japanese elementary school has its lunch arrangements, and that's also helped to contribute to enhancing the physical health for the young pupils of Japanese elementary schools. And I don't think, frankly speaking, the Abe administration has given much thought to that specific area, but I have to say that's one of the very much encouraging aspects of the bilateral relationship if one chooses to dig even deeper into that.
If I may just answer the question on health, Harpal. Under the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement signed between Foreign Minister Mayahara and Anand Sharma, our Commerce Minister, in February 2011, one of the clauses was for the working of Indian nurses and similar health workers in Japan to make it easier for such health workers to work in Japan. I'm not sure if it has got off the ground because they have some people from Indonesia and from the Philippines, but the entrance tests for the, to be able to qualify and work as a nurse in Japan are so stringent and they have to be passed in Japanese that that is almost an insuperable hurdle, which only some Indonesians and Filipinos. So this is one possible area where we could cooperate in the health sector, but beyond that, export of excellent diagnostic equipment and equipment used for cure made in Japan is an area which is open. And with the vast expansion of our own health sector in recent years, this is an area which has great potential. The exchange of human beings may not work so much because of these stringent regulations and language problems that I have referred, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement notwithstanding. But equipment, yes. Education, I already mentioned that at the university level, it needs to be enhanced. Learning from the Japanese primary education system, which is our very weak point, would be a great help to us, because it was between 1868 and 1895, in those 30 years, it was the Japanese emphasis on primary education that got that nation literate and strong enough to, within 30 years of starting its westernization, to defeat China in 1895. And they stressed primary education. They have a strong education system, and one of their greatest strengths, I think, is the primary education.
I want to go back briefly to Atul Punj's question, and I'm going to put it to you, because the players are business, because it is private sector which is central to economic development and economic growth on both sides, not the public sector. And I think that this issue of lots of MOUs to be signed, lots of protocols and all that, and then the actors themselves are not connecting with each other, which is what, I mean, my language, Atul's question. How do we deal with this? I mean, you have, as a parliamentarian of 14 years now, a lot of exposure also to business and the private sector. How do we deal with it? Is there something which should be doing on our side to make this happen, B2B really happen?
The investors or corporates of various countries, all of them have their own strengths, their own weaknesses, their own opportunities. No two companies are alike, even within the same country. So what I'm saying is, yes, it is true, as Mr. Punj pointed out. My experience also prior to politics and business has been that Japanese companies are methodical, they're very thorough, they don't take decisions lightly. And that's the point he was making, is that Indians perhaps hope for snap decisions on investments, on deals, on joint ventures, and so on and so forth. There may be companies in other countries that are capable of taking snap decisions that are very much more entrepreneurial or seat of the pants, if you will, in terms of their strategy. That doesn't mean Japanese companies don't have advantages when it comes to India. It's very clear that once that process has been gone through and Japanese companies make an investment decision, they stick it out. And they're very, very deep-pocketed. Entrepreneurial companies that take seat-of-the-pants decisions on the spur of the moment don't necessarily have the wherewithal to withstand the vagaries of business climate, business environment, and markets rising and falling. You'll see that Japanese companies, along with some other Southeast Asian companies, have an inherent strength in long-term planning. And if India seems to be right, it is not a whimsical, sudden appearance on the radar. India has come to this point, and Japanese companies are looking at India with interest, not because of something that has suddenly come up, but because of deep thought, deep planning, fitting into the strategic requirements. And there are certain sectors where, in infrastructure, for instance, where deep pockets make a huge difference. The Japanese companies have access to cheap money. They have access to long-term money. These are strengths as it is. Now, some of the other questions have already been answered by my two co-panelists about the governmental signals that they have needed. Now, similarly, I think they need governmental signals from here, from our side. If this rapprochement is going to succeed, you're right, it is going to depend very largely on private sector investments and trade between the two countries. And India has to specially reach out to Japanese corporates because of some of the issues that have been highlighted. Now, We've had programs in the past. You've been very much involved in programs of branding India to the external world. You know how it is done. It can be done. I think we sort of lost sight of the ball for a while. But now that the Japan-India relationship is top priority, clearly it is top priority. The signals are emanating from the highest levels of our government. That needs to be translated into action with specific initiatives from our government, from the Commerce Ministry, from the Foreign Ministry, and from other relevant ministries to reach out and address the concerns that specific large Japanese investors have about India.
Thank you very much. I would just add one line, Atul. I think the cultural differences between Indian companies and Japanese companies are there. So I think Indian companies, to access that huge amount of investment and partnership that is potentially there, may need to revisit their own thinking and especially be much more longer term in their perspective. Gentleman at the back.
Yeah, my name is Vishal Sinha. I just want to put out a statistic which I think all of you might find interesting and which might give a new urgency to any G2G, B2B or P2P cooperation. And this statistic was put out by Bill Gates a few days back, so we can consider it fairly credible. China used more cement in the last 3 years than the US used in the entire 20th century. So we got to, they should really set the cat amongst the pigeons.
Thank you.
China's used what? I didn't
Yes,
hear
sir.
that.
More cement in the last 3 years than the US used in the entire 20th century.
Yeah, my name is Siddharth Sivaraman, and my question is to
Sorry,
Mr.
may I just reply that question about the cement? China's rivers and air bear the consequences of that statistic.
Yeah.
Of using as much cement as the United States in the 20th century. The rivers are dying, and the air is almost as bad as Delhi, but perhaps worse, is unbreathable.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Siddharth Sivaraman, and my question is to Mr. Suresh Prabhu. Well, Mr. Tarun Das had mentioned that India should mirror China in terms of Japanese investments, $1 trillion in the next 10 years. That's almost $100 billion a year. Is India ready to absorb this level of investment? The Chinese had already done that with America. They had absorbed almost $65 to $75 billion worth of investment. India does not have the kind of energy security that we aspire to have. We have about 260,000 megawatts of electricity that is being produced. Secondly, there is a total lack of skill amongst the young people. Most of our graduates are unemployable. So if we are looking at $100 billion or even $50, $60 billion, India needs to have that kind of infrastructure on the ground to absorb that. And again, I would like an opinion from Tom, whether Japan thinks India can absorb the kind of investment that it wishes to put into India.
Let's take another question and then I'll come back to you. I think he was asking you, Suresh. Yes.
Madhurendra Jha, on technology. Japan has taken steps to liberalize some of its technology restrictions on India, but couldn't a lot more be done? For instance, is it possible now to allow Japanese companies in the future to, if they have entirely Japanese-owned companies in India, subsidiaries in India, or majority-controlled joint ventures in India, to bring in the technology without any kind of approval in Japan, based on the same terms that they would not resell it in India to a short list of negative entities. A second issue is on defense production. Now that India would like to build up a defense industrial base, what is the regulatory regime that Japan would like to see in place in order for Japanese companies to come in and participate?
Suresh?
Yeah, first of all, it all depends upon what time frame you're looking at. Are you looking at $100 billion next month? Obviously, the answer is no. If you look at a time frame of, say, 20, 25 years, and then you say 100 billion a year, it's probably less. If you look at China, China got a huge amount of money in the last decade. But China opened up in 1978. See, it's not that China started getting in 1978 $100 billion a year. So they started getting it much later when there was a readiness on the part of the economy to absorb that type of investment. So how do you do it? First of all, these macro numbers, whether $100 billion makes a sense. In next 5 years, the amount of investment India needs to put in infrastructure alone is $1 trillion, 5 years, of which $480 billion, 48% has to come from private sector. The private sector in India will not be able to find that money. Even the banking system in India doesn't have the type of money, the profile of that money, because it has to be long term, the cost of that money, which is very high cost because our inflation is high. So if you really look at it, whether we need it, we definitely need it. Are we ready for it? We have to get ready for it. Otherwise it will become a theoretical exercise in the planning commission that we need $1 trillion in 5 years and then it will remain like that. So it will be another university that could make an exercise of that kind. We on the ground need probably, if you take 20 years, not just $1 trillion, but probably something like $6 trillion of investment in the next 20 years, only in infrastructure. I'm not talking about manufacturing, I'm not talking about investment in services sector, like Docomo came, it was a service sector investment. But it is already possible that we can do it. Now to make it happen, where do you start? So that's the question I was referring to. Could we think about making special economic zones only for Japan, wherein Japanese companies will find very comfort because everything will be Japanese, including the road signs and everything. The infrastructure could also be created. That would actually facilitate a good entry point, increase comfort level. And obviously, Japanese are extremely cautious about finding out. They are not going to marry in haste. So that is something which we have to be very careful about. And there are 3 ways the Japanese money can come. It is not just FDI alone. One is ODA, which Jay mentioned, and this is India is the single largest recipient of ODA money in the world from Japan. The second is FDI route, and third is institutional investors who could put money into India for stock market or other purposes. So there are 3 streams of money that could come from Japan, and if you put all the 3 streams together, I don't think $100 billion is a much larger amount. Today it looks like, because our economy is still not $2 trillion, so to absorb that it's not easy because we don't have the type of project. But if you prepare ourselves properly, skills are matched with that, it's possible.
Tom, you haven't come in for a while. Anything you want to say at this stage? Any comments?
Yes, that's true that not many Japanese companies are like Suzuki, because Suzuki is basically Mr. Suzuki's company, where Mr. Suzuki has an ultimate say about which direction the company ought to take. But one thing that might differentiate the way in which Japanese companies conduct in foreign countries from other to do certain things, they will stick to that policy much, much longer and in a more stable fashion than perhaps many other nations, many other companies. So on that point, I would urge my Indian friends to be more optimistic about the future decisions that Japanese companies should take in India. And I have to mention that the Japanese companies have learned quite terrible, hard lessons from their involvement in China. After the Senkaku issue came up, there was an orchestrated rallies in major cities in China, very much politicized, and that almost destroyed some of the Japanese factories, including Panasonic's and so on. And the extraterritorial application of their anti-monopoly law has been used to influence in a political fashion the way in which the Japanese do businesses in China. And that application is not just about Japan. They're using the same technique towards many other nations as well. And so those political instabilities have caused a great amount of concerns among the Japanese leaders of businesses. And one should hope, and I'm the one that's very much of a view that in India, nothing of these sorts should happen in the future. So on the political stability front, I think the Japanese companies are much more relaxed vis-a-vis India than vis-a-vis China. So that's one thing that I should say to respond to one of the questions from the floor.
The question of technology, of exports from Japan and the difficulties, that has to do with, you know, the dual-use technologies, which have been going for some time. There was a time when they were far more stringent. It's to do with our not signing the NPT and the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, and so on. But gradually, the number of entities which are banned under that in India has come down drastically, as it has in the United States. But there are still some restrictions. There was a time when Dr. R. Chidambaram wasn't given a visa 3-4 years after 1998, because he was the head of BARC, and that was a banned institution. So those things have, you know, changed quite rapidly, and the effort of the government on both sides, is to bring that number down and to ease the export of technology at various levels.
Okay, there's a lady at the back who wants to ask a question, so I welcome you, and you're the first lady. And then I'm going to ask the panelists to conclude with the second part of our title, Leaders Must Capitalize. What should they do?
Hi, my name is Shamantha Rasokan. I'm from Reuters, and I just wanted to ask the panel, how important do you think the India-Japan carbon offset deal is? I believe discussions have been going on for some time. Do you think it's a central part of this India-Japan moment or just a marginal part? And also, specifically, what kind of technology do you think India should be looking to gain from this? Thank you.
Suresh is the right person for this.
Can you answer? What is it?
The carbon offset deal between India and Japan, how important is it?
See, you know, unfortunately, this is a very sad part, is that we signed the protocol in Kyoto, which was a big town in big city, one of the beautiful cities in Japan. But the Kyoto exists, but the Kyoto protocol had died. So Kyoto exists, it become more beautiful. But the protocol has evaporated, and we don't know where it has gone. So unfortunately, unless we have an agreement of international nature, which then can possibly allow the top of emission trading, which was envisaged under the Kyoto Protocol, but we never started, or the clean development mechanism, which allowed the sort of what you mean by carbon offset is some carbon credits. All that actually has not happened, unfortunately, the way it should have. So we are all waiting as a global community, and India is a big stake in that, is to find out how do we get a deal on climate globally. And I hope Japan and India can work on that, because Kyoto should not be allowed to die. That's what I believe in.
Okay, let's, we are now over time, and let's take the last comments from the panel. The second part of the title of this session was Leaders Must Capitalize. Of course, we've talked around this and all the things that need to be done, but some priority. I mean, Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Modi. When we talk about leaders, we're talking about these two gentlemen. Both clearly very committed to the Indo-Japan relationship. Prime Minister Modi, in several conversations, he said he will more or less do everything to deepen, strengthen this relationship. What should they do? Why don't we start with our Japanese guest, Tom, and then I will work my way down, I think age-wise, and come to Jay Panda last, who's probably the youngest on the panel. Tom? And by the way, great to have you here with us, and it's wonderful, this technology that you're sitting in Tokyo and we're able to interact so clearly and also see you and be seen. Over to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much once again for having me, Taran. My answer to your question is that leaders from both nations, Modi, Abe, should say to the world that India and Japan are the members of the international community that adhere to the rule of law and therefore are well prepared to guide the Indo-Pacific region into the future on national security, on economic development, on development to the poorer nations, and so on and so forth. So they can talk high jointly. Certainly, each individual, Modi, Abe, stands alone, and could stand alone and tall high, but jointly together they could even go higher. And that's what I hope to see very much from the visit of Prime Minister Modi.
And will we see Prime Minister Abe returning the visit soon to India?
That I don't know, but he's very much keen on everything Indian. So you should perhaps be surprised to see another visit or two.
Thank you. Ambassador Aftab said.
I would say that what I had said earlier, that we have to build on what is there, but you need some dramatic, diplomatic gestures which change the whole complexion of the relationship, not only between us, but
Give us one example of a dramatic, three examples, great.
The first I will give you was the Anglo-French Entente in the early 20th century, which changed a relationship. 1815, the Napoleonic Wars had just ended, and the French and the British have been at each other's throats for several hundred years before. Yeah. In 1902 was the Anglo-French Entente, and they went into the First World War as allies. Number two, the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 transformed the entire situation in Asia and the world. It enabled Japan to defeat the biggest empire of European empire, the Russian Empire, in 1905. Three, our own case. 2005, the July George Bush agreement. It's different that the nuclear part of it hasn't moved as fast as it could, but it was transformational because these two estranged democracies became engaged democracies, and across the board, you've been on the trilateral and so on, agriculture, medicine, the works, academic exchanges, and above all, energy, including nuclear energy. These were major things. Now, we need that, something like that, something like these three dramatic, transformational agreements.
Great. Suresh?
I think firstly, how to build up this relationship to its true potential. One is to work from the grassroots, which will take long time to come. So that's where the leadership role comes in, which has to be top down. The leaders must send signals, and then there must be building blocks. So I think there are three main blocks on which probably there should be substantial agreement. Both the Prime Minister should strive at. One is economic, in which we have talked about various sub-components of that, infrastructure, financing, many part of that, and it's mutually beneficial, all of the three I'm talking about. Second is energy, and that is something which Japan and India both are the net importers of energy. So this is something which is ridiculous, which can work to our both benefit if we can jointly develop with a new source of energy. And third is this military cooperation, which is extremely important for security of both the countries as well as the security for the region.
The youngest.
Well, I'll also follow the pattern and give three suggestions. I think the first has already been done, which is both leaders, right from the outset of their terms, have signaled clearly and loudly that this is the topmost priority. I quoted Prime Minister Abe, and what Prime Minister Modi is doing is in the works. The first significant visit outside of our immediate neighborhood is going to be to Japan. So the first step has already been done. The second step, and I'll talk about as far as India is concerned, I think our Prime Minister needs to address immediately, within the next quarter or so, many of these bottlenecks, because our relationship with Japan is multi-sectoral. I think the economic primacy, energy, defense cooperation, it cuts across sectors. I think he needs to take an internal review, and he's already shown that he's cutting through the thicket of rules and regulations and red tape in India in general. So specific to the Japan relationship, I think he should take a review and across these ministries address these bottlenecks and take large swipes at it. And the third thing I think he needs to do is to personally review it. It could be a quarterly review, could be a 6-monthly review of the India-Japan relationship, because if you get these fires started, if you will, I think we are looking at a completely changed landscape.
Thank you very much. I think all the 4 comments, I think we'll close it now, Ambassador, and take the suggestion offline. But I have a suggestion for the CEO of Ananta Center that after the Prime Minister has visited Tokyo, we must get the same panel back, including Tom Taniguchi, to do a review that did the leaders capitalize on this moment or not. Thank you very much, panel members. Thank you for being here.